about you 2 days ago with your friend Jacobson. I told him your outstanding lecture. He sent me greetings for you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Both here in presence, which is always nicer to actually see each other. And then there is the one-way broadcast online that you see me and I don't see you. Something like in those, I don't know if they still use them, the one-way mirrors, like for detectives used to interrogate someone so you can see what they're doing, but they can't see what you're doing. So I don't have any clue what anyone is doing out there watching this, but I hope you enjoy this presentation. The topic being, does God exist? Are atheists closer to the truth than believers? That's the topic. Yes. Now, so I hope everybody here can take a little irreverent conversation about God, but I believe that having a candid and frank discussion on these matters is far better than just avoiding the discussion of, this three-letter word called God, G-O-D, is fraught with more opinions, disagreements, arguments, wars have been fought, misconceptions than any other word in our vocabulary. There are passionate believers and there are passionate non-believers. There are people who are ready to die for and kill others in the name of God, and there are other people who are ready aggressively to attack anyone in the name of no God. So when you have such diversity, really you have to get back to the question is there really a disagreement? And perhaps the first thing to do is define what do we mean by God? Because if we have different definitions, we clearly are never going to be able to come to terms whether we believe or not believe in something without first defining the axiomatic definition of what the meaning of God is. Rabbi Yitzchak put it really powerfully when he said to a self-proclaimed atheist, he said to him, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. Which essentially means that first you have to define what God means. Now, every human being on earth fits somewhere on the spectrum. As I said, there is between the extremes of radical believers and radical atheists. You have moderate atheists, I've come to learn. You have radical and moderate agnostics. You have moderate believers. And everyone fits in somewhere there. But, as I'll suggest here, I think that many of the ideas around God and all the implications of God are really filled with many prejudices and just locked in positions without really thinking about what we're saying or what we're believing in. Because take, for example, this phenomenon. People who say, I absolutely believe in God, and yet they behave in a way that's antithetical to God. And then you have someone else who can say, I don't believe in God, and they behave in a far more noble and ethical way than the so-called believer does. So what do these words mean? Just because somebody says they believe, but if their actions are not consistent with what they believe, and someone else says I don't believe, and their actions are very fine, very refined, like a godly person, so then what do these words mean anyway? Is it just like slogans? Some people belong to this club and that club. Maybe it should be measured by actions. And if measured by actions, I would think that there are very few believers that really can say that 24/7 they live their lives as if God is right near them, and every action and every word that comes out of their mouth and every thought they have is guided by that principle. I would challenge anyone to find a person like that. So to say that one believes in God and say one does not believe, does that have any significance? Does it have any meaning? Now let's take this a little further. A little more philosophical even. Say God exists, one has to really define what does the word exist mean. What does the word exist mean? For example, if you said, does love exist? Someone will say, well, based on empirical evidence of the five senses, you can't prove that love exists. Just like you can't see subatomic particles. So the word exists is also a very deceptive word. For one person something exists, for another person on a different level it doesn't exist. We see physical objects in this world. We could see with our eyes, we hear sounds, we taste, touch, and smell. But none of those five senses can capture what a molecule or an atom or a subatomic particle looks like. So then you have to define what the word exists means. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And what criteria do we use? If you take even a step further, the real quandary is this. If indeed there is a creator, I'm only saying if to satisfy the skeptic. If indeed there is a creator, can the creature really be the one that defines whether there's a creator or not? Is the creator that creates the creature, not the creature that creates the creator. So what can a creature really say about its creator? What can a piece of art say about the artist? It's a product of the artist. Let's go further. All logic and reason, if indeed there's a creator, the creator also created logic and reason. So to use logic and reason to try to understand the creator is a contradiction of terms. Because you can't bind the creator of logic and reason to the laws of logic and reason. In the words of physicists, something within a system cannot understand something outside of the system. Can we really perceive something outside of our own structure? So then we get ourselves into a complete new dilemma, which is any God we talk about is really a God only simply based on our terms. What we determine is the context and so on. It may not even be what God really is, because we're the ones talking about. Think of it this way. If we're part of a whole reality, how much can the part tell us about the whole when you're only a part? You're only one little piece of it. So there are much more dilemmas than one think when you talk about God, even though people so flippantly talk about God. God exists, I do believe, I don't believe. And then, of course, the fact is that if it was so simple to prove or disprove God, then we'd have no argument, would we? Clearly, it's not that simple. All the proofs are rejected by people who don't want to accept those proofs. And the disproofs are rejected by people who do accept the proofs. So then what are the proofs worth? It's just a matter of choices. And you see that as a fact. You see the way look at the world. So in a sense, it's like a circular type of argument because you get nowhere. There are people who believe, and those that don't. And you could argue that belief is very much part of culture. Some people grew up with that, and therefore it's comfortable for them to believe in God. And some didn't. Or you could argue the other way around. Those that grew up with it may be the ones that rejected because they saw how hollow or hypocritical it was. So they're prejudiced the other way around. Anyway, as you see, basically, subjectivity comes into play big time in this discussion. So throwing out all these questions, my goal is really to be provocative, intentionally, and most importantly, to be able to address this in an intelligent manner, to say what can we know, what can we not know. Because there's no question in the world that just like a piece of art can tell you very little about the artist. It can tell you that the artist has the capacity to create such art. But what else can it tell you about the artist? If the art was able to speak. Just like a computer or any machine, what can it tell you about its engineer? Very little. Because they're not in the same reality. So the question is, do we have even the tools to talk about God? And if we do talk about God, is it not merely simply another God that's an extension of our way of thinking? A God that we decide we need, a crutch, something that we feel gives us solace or comfort, etc., etc. So I decided to address this week for the reason being, because in this view, Yochel, you could think that the Kameni, that you could be as holy as God is. And the Medrash says, no. Talmud Lema comes say, Ki kadashani, kedushasi l'mayla mikdushaschem. My holiness is higher than yours. Which of course begs the question, what's the point the Torah is trying to tell us that God is holier than us? I mean, if someone believes in God, that's obvious. So there's an interesting Hasidic interpretation. It actually turns around the Medrash and says something quite radical. It says the way you're supposed to read it is, Yochel Kamoyin, not a question, you may think that you're as holy as God. That's actually read as a statement. You can be as holy as God. Why? Tushasi l'mayla, not l'mayla is interpreted as my holiness is greater than yours, but Kedushasi Lamaila, my holiness above, is Migdushas is derived from and comes from your holiness. In other words, you sanctify me. Which turns the whole meaning around, that basically we have the power essentially to make God holy or to desecrate God. So reading that, I just thought it was appropriate. It could be any week, this topic, just to talk about God and our relationship and understanding of the whole concept and so on and so forth. You want to say something?
Well, I wanted to ask, you said before that you cannot prove the Creator from the creation. And maybe you could, because if you look at a piece of art, it's impossible for somebody to give.
Okay, so then I'm asking you, so 24/7 do you live without God? And have you ever done something that's not godly? If it's so... Now, I'm saying if it's so provable, why is it that you can behave or I can behave in a way that goes against that? So even if you have that's a nice argument, and then there are many but just reject it. They have many explanations otherwise. It was a rhetorical question. Now, so taking all this into account, I think it's important to first establish a few things. I'll go now with the argument, if there is no God, if the universe is some way evolved on its own, and that ball of gas that goes back 12 billion years ago, whatever, either created itself or was always there, however you explain that. Right. Then, of course, obviously with that type of approach, then all we have is ourselves and our own minds. And you can't really go very far with that as far as God goes, because you've determined that we're self-made creatures. And really there's no discussion if a person accepts that. Obviously there are many mysteries still to the left, because even if you can explain how those gases evolved into forms of life, you still have to explain how the gases got there. And as you just said accurately, one of the arguments in the Kuzri and other books is the concept of Ein Dover Eises Atzmei, nothing can create itself. There's nothing in cause, so to speak, has to have a cause before it, which is the conventional argument of nothing can create itself. Now, many scientists and others choose to reject that argument, because I believe it's not purely because of logic, because there's also another factor. And I've talked about this to a number of scientists that consider themselves atheists. I said, I know you accuse believers of being closed-minded. A believer just believes, and no proof in the world is going to shake that belief. Right? Whereas a scientist is a person who should be able to be open to all arguments, whether for God or against God, without any prejudice. But there's one question here. We all know that in any type of intelligent argument, there has to be what we call full disclosure. Right? We have to be transparent. Now, in a court of law, the first question that you would ask about any given issue is, the parties involved, do they have any bias or any interest in a resolution that is either one way or the other way? If a judge, for example, is invested financially or otherwise because of a relative in the verdict being guilty or not guilty, he or she has to recuse themselves because they're biased. Now, this God issue has a lot of bias involved. Number one bias is that if there is indeed a God, it would compel us to be accountable. Who wants to be accountable? So we all have invested interest, because if there is a God and it's absolute so, and God put you here, then that would compel us to accept that we are responsible to God. I think many people are invested in making sure they're not responsible and accountable. So I've asked a number of scientists, why don't you make that statement before you make your argument? Say, you know something? I have benefit to believe that there is no God, because then I can do what I wish. So just like you're expecting believers to be open and transparent and say we have biases because either we believe because we grew up that way, or because we believe because it makes us easier to deal with pain, or whatever it is, why don't you say the same thing, that you have interest involved in the fact that there is a conclusion that can have consequences. And therefore that would somewhat bias you to try to argue there is no God. Like you'll often hear the argument, very often, that in the primitive times people had no other way of explaining phenomena except with God. If there was an earthquake, if there was a hurricane, if there's something else that happened, it had to be God's hand. But today that we have natural ways to explain it, scientific ways, we don't need God. That's one of the arguments against God. But that's a very limited perspective on God. There's many other reasons that you could come to God, even with a world like ours. Like I just mentioned, the argument of nothing can create itself. But above all, we all are looking for ways to make our lives more comfortable. If you had a choice to be accountable or not accountable, which one would you choose? If you really had complete choice, and you're honest. Most people would rather be less accountable, let's be honest. Maybe at times, we like the idea to be responsible to someone. But on our terms, especially when it comes to personal matters. So I searched and searched. I wanted to see if there's any scientist ever in history who argued against God that was ready to say, be open. Now, believers, you're going to find a lot of closed-minded believers who are not ready to be objectively describe why they believe. But believers can be dismissed because they're not using logic. But a scientist and a thinker and a free thinker is following logic. So if he's following logic, why does he not accept that element? So I did find one. Aldous Huxley. I'll paraphrase because I don't remember the exact language. It's quite eloquent. He writes the following. He was an agnostic, maybe even an atheist. I don't remember what he called himself. So what did he write? What did he write? He wrote the following. I'm invested in the fact that there should be no God, because then I can do it as I wish, especially in the area of sexuality. These are his words. Pretty blunt. And therefore, all my arguments follow that my first axiom. Now, I was very taken that he wrote that. Why? Because at least he's honest. He's not coming to say, listen, I'm an objective guy, and I'm doing my research, and whatever conclusion I'll accept. No, he's very interested in a particular conclusion, and that's that. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily say that this doesn't prove or disprove God. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, the Austrian-British philosopher of science, writes, famously, that a scientific hypothesis has to be able to be disproven, not just proven, disproven. If you cannot disprove a scientific hypothesis, it's not science, because science is subject to the rules of proof and disproof. That's why you see theories come and go. Now, some theories withstand the test of time, but a theory is exactly that. It's the best working theory for what we have, and results and other ways of proving it and replicating, etc. And he gives the example. To say that God exists cannot be a scientific statement because no one can disprove it. Whether you can prove it or not, but no one can disprove it. That's why even the most radical atheists in their moment, if you ask them, are you certain, 100% certain there's no God? They'll never say that, 100% certain. They'll say, I'm also not 100% certain there are no fairies, as Christopher Hitchens, Olav HaShalom, said. Christopher Hitchens had a Jewish mother. As the three famous atheists of our time, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, two Jews, and the third one, Richard Dawkins. He's not been yet found to be Jewish. But these are, Christopher Hitchens wrote, God is not great. Each had their books on this topic. So Hitchens has said a number of times, before he passed away a few years ago, he can't disprove it absolutely. But the burden of proof lies on those that believe, not those that don't. So this would be called, agnostic is someone who's in doubt, no proof either way. Atheist is someone who's almost sure or very sure, and so on. I'm not going to go through every particular level. I once wrote an article about this topic, and I was rudely reminded by a number of atheists, because I just piled all the atheists together, and they said there are many different, just like there are many types of believers, there are many types of atheists. I alluded to earlier, there are radical atheists, there are moderate atheists, there are average atheists. So atheism itself has many schools of thought. I think there's American Atheistic Society of America or something like that. So there you can go through, you can check it out online, if you happen to be interested in that. So going back to the topic at hand, so we're left with what? What are we left with there? Now, for those that do believe and do accept there's a God, there comes And there are those that just do it out of cultural reasons and don't give it much thought. They haven't thought about it too much. But those that have thought about it and have challenged it come to a conclusion that if there's indeed a God, that's the only reason we can talk about God, because God himself gave us information and embedded in our DNA ways to understand the Creator. So that basically essentially states that there is a given that if God created the universe, created it with design and purpose, and communicated that design and purpose, or else there'd be no point to existence and creation. And as such, God also revealed to us ways to communicate or ways to understand what God is about. Or in the words of the Bible, God created the human being in the divine image, and therefore we in our own personality, or as the book of Job puts it, from my flesh I behold God. If you study the art and you study the creation, which is created in the shape and image of the Creator, then you can get a sense of what the Creator is like. And that's going to be part of what I'm going to be discussing shortly in understanding God. But let's do this in a process of elimination, working our way backwards from the bottom up. I mentioned before, we have to determine what does it mean. Before we define what God is, we have to define what means existence. Or I better rephrase, what does reality mean? I've discussed this somewhat in my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, in the chapter on God. So some of these ideas, if you want to follow up, you can check it out in that chapter. I'm going to elaborate more than that is there. So I think the first thing that I think an intelligent approach to this has to be is looking at the tools and the logic and reason we use to determine anything. How do we know anything exists? So there were philosophers, I forget who by name, that argued and could argue, and anyone could argue this, that all of existence is an illusion. Can anybody disprove that? It's impossible to disprove, because any proof or disproof is part of the illusion. If, for example, like the Matrix showed, that all of existence as we know it is a computer program that somebody is controlling, so anything we come up with, proving or disproving, is all part of that program. So it's built in that you can't disprove that existence is an illusion. So how do we come to to accept that existence is a reality and not an illusion? It just simply, like many other axioms, that we just accept it to be that way. I don't know if you know this, but science, especially Karl Popper as well, and more than Karl Popper, also Gödel, the great mathematician, and similarly Heisenberg in physics, quantum mechanics, made the argument that, and it's been accepted now as a scientific fact, that science, even with all its logic and reason, always has to have axioms that are not necessarily based on reason. Even mathematics, which was considered to be the absolute science, everything is provable. So Gödel demonstrated in the mid-20th century, which was very radical, but he proven that even mathematics is based on certain givens that just all mathematicians and all scientists accept. Because every system has to have axioms. And axioms do not necessarily mean they've been reasoned or proven. They're not irrational, but they're not necessarily a proof. I'll give you a classic example. It's accepted by all scientists that if you have several theories to explain a phenomenon, you choose the simplest explanation. Nobody knows why. It's just accepted that the simplest theory, the simplest explanation is the one that will be accepted unless it's disproven. Why? Because scientists, you could say the logic works that you try to find the simplest path to answer questions. But someone could say, how do you know? Maybe the most complex answer should be the one. Now, this is not meant to, this was the word I want to say, to discredit the scientific method. It's just meant to be honest about what science is and what it's not. So a real scientist will tell you, I don't need God to explain much of existence, or maybe all of it. Because I can explain how human beings evolved from apes, that evolved from lower species, all the way back to bacteria, to that ball of gas. If you ask me what was before the ball of gas, science has nothing to answer because we were not there. We have no witnesses, and we're trying to figure it out. We have theories. That's what an honest scientist will tell you. Is it possible that God started the whole thing? Yeah. How could I say not? Again, a scientist who does not have any interest in bias or has no preconceived notions. That would be the approach. You could say, I can explain much without it, but I can't explain everything without it. But once I use God, the scientist will say, I've gone out of the world of science. We've gone from physics to metaphysics. Okay, that's a fair discussion. So I don't claim that I am an expert in that area, and I only can talk about phenomenon that I can relate to, or that can be discussed with some type of empirical or other forms of extrapolation that scientists have by consensus agreed to, and that's what we approach it with. But let's go back to what I'm saying is, so how do we determine? So the first axiom is that we accept that existence is real. It's not an illusion. Because if it's an illusion, all our discussions are meaningless. But if it's real, so then how do we define reality? How would you define reality? So the obvious, as I said, we'll start from the bottom up. The first way you define reality is by saying, my five senses. Since I've accepted that my eyes, what they see, is real, it's not an illusion, even though, of course, you can argue we see magicians, sleight of hand, and we could be fooled with optical illusions. But let's, for argument's sake, most things that we see, we can rely on. We all see this white wall. If you showed it to 1 million people, they'd all describe it the same way. So that's pretty much strong evidence that there is a white wall here, and that it's white, and that it's shaped so-and-so. Why? Because enough eyes have seen it and borne witness. That is considered to be fact. That's what we would call a fact. In other words, anything that our senses experience, let's say all of us would agree is a fact. Enough people heard a sound, you'll say, okay, I accept that, even if I didn't hear it. If enough people tell us that George Washington existed a few hundred years ago, and there's news accounts, and there's enough witnesses and enough books and so on, you don't come to think, oh, there's a conspiracy of 50 people or 100 or 1,000 people that have created an illusion called George Washington, and they just created forged newspapers and forged books and forged witnesses, false witness, and now we don't say that. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. But there's certain accepted verification, what we call facts. If enough witnesses, testimony from different parties, across the board. So this is called the empirical approach. And we'll take questions at the end, because since there's a class, and a lot of people, so if you don't mind. Okay, so this is, you have many, so our senses tell us a certain dimension of reality. But if you limit it to that, then comes the question, one second, what about things that the senses don't experience? And I mentioned one before. I mentioned love. Love. You say, I love this person. How can you empirically prove that? All you can say is, I feel love. Someone else says, I don't feel it. I believe you that you say it, but I mean, how do you measure the reality of this thing called love? How do you measure the reality even of love in general? So clearly you need something more than just senses. Because there's nothing that your eyes, your ears, your taste, touch, and smell can measure in what we call love. So we know because we have other senses. We have supersensory tools. Since I know I can love somebody, so I can imagine that you can love somebody. So in a sense, it's through the common human experience that we can identify other realities. Same thing with ideas. Nobody's ever seen an idea. Ideas are creations of the mind. But because you come up with ideas, so you can accept that someone else comes up with ideas. Why would you not? So here you have a next level of experience which is not directly witnessed or experienced with the five senses, but nevertheless is considered to be also factual. Now, how far can you go with logic here? So you can go pretty far. Because now, let's say, I just spoke about conscious ideas. What about unconscious? Conscious ideas, as I said, you can experience through common human experience. But what about unconscious? How do we know there's an unconscious? And the answer is because logic dictates that if conscious mind is aware of certain ideas as we speak right now, and you know that you have many more ideas inside your mind that you're not conscious of, you have to say that your brain contains many other ideas that you're not aware of at this moment. We also know that human life experiences as children become embedded in our personalities. So any type of trauma that we experience or any type of positive thing affects our behavior later. That's not a conscious thing. That's what is called unconscious. Now, no one has ever seen the unconscious, but you can extrapolate what is called in Torah language, Yediyas HaShlila, which means you can't see it directly, but you can infer, or call extrapolate, instead of intrapolation, there's extrapolation, that it exists. The black hole is a perfect example in physics of extrapolation. There are scientists and physicists that deny that there's the concept of a black hole, or what they call today black matter, black energy, dark energy, and so on. Because no one can see a black hole. By definition, it's black. How do we know it exists? So the theory goes like this, because when you see areas, large areas in space that are behaving erratically and are moving about in ways and you can't explain why they would be moving that way. So the theory that first Einstein posited and then he actually retracted and then came back to it is that there must be a body there that's exerting such a powerful gravity that's affecting the movement of anything that comes in its proximity. But no one's seen those bodies. You just see their effect. So, for example, if there was I was holding a magnet, right, on this side of a wall. You can't see me or the magnet. But you see on the other side of the wall metal pieces moving around strangely. So you can extrapolate and say, you know what? There must be something exerting energy that's causing an erratic movement of metal. So you can extrapolate and say and infer there must be somewhere a magnet, even though you can't see it. Applying it psychologically to the unconscious, you could see, for example, a trained psychologist, therapist. I'm talking about a good one. There are many bad ones, but talking about a good one. Would be, what do they see that others don't see? You go to a trained person who's able to talk to you, able to have a conversation, and they can come away with somewhat of an understanding of your psyche that another person does not come away with. What is it that they have? Is it an instinct? Is it an intuition? Is it something you could be trained? So one of the ways to understand it, yes, clearly some people simply understand human beings better, or may have experienced themselves certain experiences in life, so making them more empathetic and can relate to other people who've had trauma or pain and so on. So one of the ways to explain it is the following. Like when you go to a physical doctor, medical doctor, and let's say you have a pain in your arm or a pain elsewhere, God forbid, so the doctor will ask some questions, then may examine you, and come away with, let's say you have pain in your right arm. Okay, touch here. And you start saying, oh, that's where it hurts. And he tries and feels it out, and gets a sense, if need be, take an X-ray or CAT scan or another a sonogram or something else, to try to understand what are the causes that the physical eye, the naked eye cannot see. So the trained physician, knowing human anatomy, having experience, can pretty much identify, not always, but can identify from symptoms causes that most of us are not trained cannot. No different than, for example, people who are very experienced in business can forecast certain things, not because they're prophets, because their experience has taught them to look for certain signs that the average novice cannot see. Anyone with a level of expertise, whatever area it is going to see things that the novice cannot see. You look at it, it'll look like random, someone else will see a pattern. The same thing is psychologically. A person who's trained can ask the right questions and can have a discussion and can learn from that much about your psyche more than you yourself may be even willing to share. Because they know how you respond. You study body language. For example, most of us, in areas where there's a lot of pain, psychic pain, meaning personal pain, psychological pain, we avoid. We don't like to discuss it, just like you avoid touching something where there's a raw nerve, a tender nerve. So a trained person who's asking questions suddenly sees, for example, you don't want to talk about your mother. And you say, is everything all right with your mother? Yeah, perfect, we have a great relationship, so let's talk about it. And if you see resistance, you can pretty much extrapolate there's something going on there. Now, I'm not talking about in any way an assault or anything that crosses boundaries and trying to, try to find out about someone's life without their cooperation. I'm talking about a trained person will do it gently and sensitively. So think of it, this is the way I always put it, is like think of an imaginary wall shrouded in darkness. And you can't touch this wall, and you can't shine a light on it. But you want to know what it looks like. Is it a straight wall? Is it a jagged wall? Is it a broken wall? What options do you have to be able to figure out what the wall? You can't touch it, you can't see it, and you can't shine a light on it. So here's one option. You take a rubber ball, and you bounce it against the wall, and you see how it bounces back to you. If it bounces straight, you know that's a straight area in the wall. And you keep bouncing the ball again and again and again, and you can get something like a sonar. Sonars that pick up the entire topography of, let's say, the ocean bed, even though no one's gone there, but the sonar gives you back signals that you can identify the contours and the shape and form of something. So the same thing is here. By having a conversation with someone and seeing how they react, with enough conversations, you can get yourself somewhat of a picture of what the psyche looks like. Not an entire picture, and it's not always perfect, but someone who's trained can get that sense. So here you have a new tool that's not interpolation. It's not empirically observable or experienced through the five senses. It's not experienced through common experience, like I said before about love and ideas, and it's because it's the unconscious, but clearly other evidence has brought you to come to conclusions that there's something there and you can figure out somewhat of what it may look like. This is essentially, by the way, how the physicists see the atomic and subatomic world. You know, an atom has never been seen by the human race. There's no person that can see subatomic particles. And there's no instrument, even the strongest electron microscopes cannot see subatomic particles. They're just too microscopic. But you could see their effect. You see their impact. You know, that model that we learned in high school, that atoms look like a bunch of grapes, with the neutrons being white and protons being black and electrons looking like a field of energy. That's simply a working model to allow us to work with something. No one knows if atoms look that way at all. So there's a lot of imagery we get that doesn't mean it looks like that. It's something just to work with so you can understand. But there's no question that they're subatomic particles. So who was it? I think it was Sir Arthur Eddington, maybe. I forgot his name. One of the physicists in the mid-20th century, early 20th century, was asked the classic question, if no one has ever seen subatomic particles, how can you come to these bizarre, and they called it bizarre, spooky world of quantum mechanics. It's called spooky physics, even till this day, because its conclusions were all counterintuitive. Whereas in Newtonian physics, for example, everything is defined by classic physics of cause and effect. The billiard ball effect. So the billiard ball effect is what? That when you hit a billiard, if you hit with a cue, you hit a ball this way, every time you'll hit it this way on that angle, it will always have the impact on the next ball the same way. This predictable, deterministic universe. This is the way physics was seen all the way till the beginning, or the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Then came Einstein with the theory of special relativity, and then later quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and the others, and determined that in the microscopic universe, not macroscopic, in the microscopic universe, there's a whole new reality that is absolutely indeterministic, states of probability, these are their words, where you cannot determine certain things. And it was adamantly fought by Einstein himself, said, it doesn't make sense. One of the lines he used when he spoke to Niels Bohr about it was, God does not play dice with the universe. Everything is predictable. Everything is logical. And Niels Bohr purportedly responded, don't tell God what to do. Very similar to what I said earlier in this class, that if God is the one that determines whether it's deterministic or not we do. And Einstein, till his last days, even though he had to admit certain conclusions, was very disturbed by this type of approach because it was not logical, seemingly. So Arthur Eddington, I think it was asked, how can you come to such bizarre conclusions? For example, is light a wave or a particle? So any physicist will tell you it depends. It can be both, it could be neither. It depends who measures it and when they measured it. Because in Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, without going into deep physics here, states that the velocity and position of an atom cannot be determined at the same time. And therefore, the one who measures it creates from an indeterministic state a deterministic one. Schrodinger's cat you may have heard of. I mean, many other examples that are very counter-logical. Yet, but they've been proven too many times for science to deny, and that's why it's accepted facts today. A number of years ago, there was a book called The Most Reliable Machine on Earth is based on the most unreliable rule. Computers are the most reliable machine, and it's based on the uncertainty principle, which allows us to manipulate subatomic particles based on quantum mechanics. So he gave this analogy. How can you come to such conclusions by things you've never seen? And his analogy was with a fisherman who spread his net across the seas and gathered up all the types of fish, documented the different species, different colors, different shapes, different sizes, and then came to a master conclusion. What was that? That there are no fish in the sea that are shorter than a half-inch long. And he's ready to make an announcement. His little daughter hears he's about to make this announcement. She says to him, what does the net look like? Let's see the net that you used to capture the fish. She looked at the net, and he looks at the net. The net had spaces in the ropes that were half-inch wide and long. So obviously, all the fish that were shorter than a half-inch long fell back into the water. So this great scientist was about to make a conclusion which would have been accurate, but his conclusion should have included one simple thing. If you use a net that has half-inch spaces in the ropes, you're never going to catch fish that are shorter than a half-inch long. But you don't need a scientist to know that. Everyone can figure that out. His analogy was, what tools are you using? If you want to use a net with half-inch, you're going to only find fish that are longer than half-inch. If you want to experience things that you can see with the naked eye, then you'll see certain things in reality. If you want to experience something that's seen by a microscope, then you see that. You need different type of tools to experience and know subatomic particles and their movement and how they function. Which, of course, tells you that something that is very, in a way, unsettling. Because human beings love to worship their own logic. Suddenly, your logic is not good enough. Because your logic, just like your instruments, are limited. They're limited by your logic. So initially, it almost seems like undermining our entire processes. Because then you can't rely on your logic, you can't rely on reason, you can't rely on empirical proof, you can't rely even on extrapolation. So what are you relying on? The answer is maybe you have other tools that you just have not yet accessed. Just like, let's go back to love. Many people who are very, very cerebral and big brains have difficulty with relationships, with emotional relationships. Because they may be intellectually intelligent, but they're not emotionally intelligent. And when you tell them, you're very book smart, but you have no common sense. You're very brilliant, but you don't know how to emote. You don't know how to be vulnerable. And many of them will look at you and say, I don't know what you're talking about. I've tested this a number of times. What's going on? They have tools, they have their tools, and that works for them. And they have never developed the tools of emotion. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean it's not capable. It means that they're not ready to go there. So how intellectually honest is that? You're ready to go only into the meadows and the horizons that you are comfortable with. The first sign of intelligence is that you're ready to embrace something that may be something you're not comfortable with. If comfort is the ultimate the arbiter and decision maker in finding truth, you can imagine what our truths are going to look like. So the mere fact that we talk about God, it really is challenging our tools. Because like I go back to the initial points that I made, the questions I asked were not meant just to be questions. It was meant to show that you're talking about God as if God is another reality, like let's say, a sunset, or something you can observe, or at least experience with supersensory tools. If subatomic particles can be experienced with any instrument that we know of, and you need to have different type of tools to relate to it, what about God? And do we have the instruments to relate to a God? So let's talk about we're going further and further. So far, I've said, reality can be defined by empirical tools, which is the senses. It can be defined by intellectual and emotional tools. It can be defined by extrapolation, process of elimination, and determining there must be something behind the curtain, even though I can't see it. Like I said, the invisible wall that I described. And you can keep on extrapolating. For example, if I were to ask anyone here, beyond subatomic particles, how far down the rabbit hole can we go? Are there subatomic, sub? An intelligent person today would say, I have no clue. My logic actually would dictate that it's probably an endless road. Because why should it stop? Just because I don't know, I haven't seen it. It would be like someone climbing and saying, okay, what does the horizon look like? You're standing on the ground. And you'll describe the horizon. And then someone else, okay, go up, let's say 100 to 1,000 feet up on a mountain. What does it look like now? Oh, different description. Now, go up 10,000 feet. What does it look like now? A different description. Let's say hypothetical is a mountain that goes 100,000 feet up. Today people landed on the moon. What did they see? Earth has a completely different look. What does all this tell you? That the more you know, the more you know how much there is more to know. And that does not minimize our knowledge. Using the words of Rabbi Yosef Alba in the book called Sefer Ikrim. It's called the book of foundations, the book of fundamentals. He says, Tachlis hayediyah shaloi neda. The ultimate of knowledge is to know that you don't know. Now that doesn't dismiss what you know. On the contrary, it enhances it. And then there's an interpretation, the ultimate of knowledge is to know the unknowable. Whether this is an urban legend or not, I don't know, but in 1898, the word goes around, you can look it up online, there's an argument whether it ever happened or not, no one can determine, doesn't matter. The point is this, that the U.S. patent, the head of the U.S. patent office, the head officer of the U.S. patent office, the one that issues patents and for inventions and so on, resigned, saying in 1898 that everything that could be invented has been invented, and there's no purpose for him to keep his job. He could close down the department. Okay. This, remember, was in the height of the Industrial Revolution. Electricity was discovered, the steam engine was discovered, the turbine was discovered. Industrialization was going full force. Most of, for example, New York's infrastructure was built 100 years ago. The subway system, the bridges. So it was pretty great feats that still stand, and we can still marvel. So it was not surprising that he came to the conclusion everything that could be invented has been invented. Now, mind you, 1898 is pre-Einstein, pre-quantum mechanics, pre-atomic and nuclear revolution, pre-computer and information age, and pre-everything we know, including the internet and so on and so forth. Now, would anyone today, 10 years later, 115 years later, say, you know what, everything that can be created has been invented? On the contrary. With all that's happened in the last 100 years, we know that we haven't even scratched the surface. So more knowledge has taught us that there's much more that we'll ever know. Take the human body. The human body is a little box, 5-6 feet tall, 100, 200 pounds. We won't go higher than that. Sometimes a little more. And very small compared to outer space, compared even to the ocean. And yet, how much do we know about this human body? So we know much. Longevity, age expectancy is double from 1920s. I think it was 44, 45 then. Now it's almost 80. For women, a little higher. Medical breakthroughs, the elimination of diseases that killed so many. So no one argues that medicine and medical miracles are... But ask an honest, objective, humble doctor, the best. What do we know about the human body? What do we know about the world of infertility? What about the brain? The brain, the size of the palm of my hand, a little bigger. Whatever we know, everyone knows that there's so much more that it's complete mystery, usually. That doesn't mean we can't do many things, but it means that our tools that we've had till now are limited, and there are many more other tools. So now let's talk about God. Let's talk about God now. I go back to the question. If all this I've said now, and this does not require any faith, does not require any belief, does not require any religion. Everything I've said till now. It requires simple intelligence dictates that there's more down the rabbit hole, as I said, beneath the surface. Much, much more. And if there's an unconscious, there's definitely an unconscious. And it goes on and on and on. So then, why is it when it comes to God, are we so simplistic and not applying the same type of intelligence? Here we're talking the possibility. I say possibility only because I accept it as a God, but I only say it to satisfy the objective inquiry here. So if the possibility that a God exists would mean that there's a creator that put all this in place, and all this complexity, as deep as it goes, has something even deeper that when you cut to the core, you'll find that highest reality called the divine source of it all. That's so illogical. I don't find that illogical at all. I mean, even people who don't have belief in faith took some psychedelics, and they all came back with the same conclusion, that there's some higher force behind it all. You know how many people came to believe in God because of LSD? Or because of some other hallucinogens and other psychedelic experiences? I'm not suggesting that's a proof. But I'm suggesting if hundreds, thousands and thousands of people came to realize, what did they come to realize? That which any logic can tell you, that there's a lot more going on beneath this, behind the scenes. As a matter of fact, that's far more real than what we see. So if I were to ask you now a question, I started out the process of elimination working our way from the bottom up, what we see with our eyes. Now that we know what we know scientifically, and I'm not even discussing God for a moment, what is more real? The subatomic particles that shape everything in existence, or the objects that we see with our eyes? I'll put it this way, the DNA in your body, or the physical body that you have that you see in the mirror? The answer is obvious. What you see is just the surface level tip of the iceberg. Just because you're comfortable with it and you see it all the time doesn't mean that it's the most real aspect. It's like saying, what's more real, the symptom or the cause? The symptom you see. Someone said, I have a toothache, I have a headache. Yeah, obviously you feel it and you know it is very real. But what is real? The toothache or what's causing the toothache to take? And the cause is always invisible. Or not always, most of the time. So what you conclude from this is a very interesting reverse hypothesis. And that is that the more visible it is, maybe the less real it is. And the more invisible it is, the more real it is. So in other words, reality is not defined by us. It's defined by the causes that shape us. And we know clearly that everything in existence has causes. That's the whole basis of science. So even though no one's ever seen gravity, but you see the impact of gravity. So clearly gravity is a force. Electromagnetism. The other two, nuclear strong force, the weak force. These are energies you've never seen. Have you ever seen electricity? But you sure know it exists. You touch, God forbid, a live wire, you're going to feel it. You look at appliances, you look at the world lit up, alive, energized, something's energizing it. But what does electricity look like? Can you tell me? I know the images we have looks like lightning bolts. We envision it as some type of flow, but it's not subject to the senses. But it's undeniable, and we can generate it, and we can regulate it, and we can control it. Where does water come from? You ever think about water? So we know the water that comes into our houses do not originate in the pipes, obviously. Right? They originate, the pipes are pumping water from arteries, water mains that lie under the ground, right? Where do those water mains lead you to reservoirs that can be hundreds of miles away? New York's reservoirs are hundreds of miles from here. They gather water through rainwater and other sources. Okay? But where does the water come from? Where does rainwater come from? So rainwater can be traced to the seas, to the evaporation that creates the clouds, etc., etc. And where do the seas get their water from? So that goes back to deep under the ground of the seas. You have the sources of springs, live springs, that come from the center of the earth, which, by the way, is complete fire and lava, everything antithetical to water. Can you explain how the belly of the earth, which is heat that's comparable to the heat of the sun, and creating volcanic eruptions, is causing water to come when water is... So the answer is that once it cools off, the lava turns into water, whatever, all the different theories. But how many of us have even traced it all the way back to the source? We trace it. We know We're pretty happy if you get bottled water or water coming out of your faucet with a filter, no filter, that's about it. I'm just trying to point out how we are really very superficial people. And I include myself. We worship what we see. We're seduced by our senses. You can hear every truth in the world, and you're standing outside, and a beautiful woman walks by, or another sight, you will be attracted by it. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about. Because we are people of senses. We are sensory creatures who value what we see, what we hear, we taste, touch, and smell. We would not have $1 trillion advertising industry or $1 billion advertising industry and everyone vying for our attention in one way or another if it didn't have power. We're hypnotized by this world. Let's be honest. So obviously the roots of things and the sources of things may intrigue us. Everybody wants to know what makes a clock tick. We all like to take things apart, but with a limit. So the search for God is actually the greatest search in history because you're searching for the root of it all. And the people who seriously searched for it, starting from Abraham, they never stopped. This is what I describe now at length, is basically Abraham's journey. He grew up in a pagan home, in a pagan world. You know what they worshipped? They worshipped idols. They worshipped gods that they could see. Maimonides has a fascinating introduction to the laws of idolatry in his book Mishnah Torah that describes how did people become idol worshippers. And his answer, the way he explains it is brilliant. It's fascinating. That initially Adam and Eve knew there was some invisible force, reality that put everything here. But then human beings felt uncomfortable with looking for invisible because we want something visible. So they began to attribute to stars. That's why it's called star worship. Because stars, they didn't say stars are God. They said stars are God's handiwork. They're God's instruments. And they began to identify with stars. But stars are very far away. So they began to identify with trees and objects on earth that they said correspond to different constellations and stars. And then came the next level of the what do we call it, the con artists and the charlatans who said, you know what, people are worshiping that. Let's create a building around certain trees and around certain objects, and we'll sell entrance fee. We'll make some money on it. And here, slowly, generation by generation evolved. Instead of accepting that the source of it all is invisible and beyond you, we want to have a God or some type of deity that we can relate to. A tree, a sun, a moon, other objects. So it didn't begin foolishly, someone's going to just bow down to a stone or to a tree. These became symbols of God's hand. But then the symbols became God, and God was forgotten. Comes Abraham, in his intelligence, even as a child, recognizes there's no way that all these objects, which are just like me and you, and they're mortal, and they will die, and they're subject to all the erosion and the effects of a mortal universe, can be the source of it all. Like I said earlier, the world does not dictate that it's a source. So he came to start extrapolating. So where is it? He went out to the meadows, looked up to the heavens. First he said the sun, the moon. No, but the sun and moon are just extension of this universe. The sun sets, the moon sets. He realized they're all the same, limited. And then he came to the big realization that took him many years to come to realize. That's the other way around. He's looking for God. He's looking for God on his terms. He realized he has to stop looking. Shut down all your senses and God will emerge. That's what he came to realize. Because as I said earlier, the part cannot dictate what the whole is like. How could a creature discover the Creator? You can extrapolate, you can figure out there must be something, but how could you relate to the Creator? Only by shutting down his own tools. So think of this way. Shut down your senses. Your sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. What are you going to be left with? So initially the thought may be daunting, may be frightening. You think you disappear. You won't disappear. You'll be left with yourself. That's not shaped by and defined by senses. When's the last time you tried that? Try it out. You can't try it out right now because because if you want to hear what I'm going to say, you can't shut your sound, but try it out. Just a total silence where you have all your senses shut down, if possible. You're going to start hearing yourself, a voice within. Abraham came to realize if he wants to find God, he has to allow God find him. He has to shut down, which we call humility, complete silence, instead of aggressively trying to find God like we find other things in life, like finding a loaf of bread or finding an answer to our problem, realize, let me shut everything down, and the essence of it all, the core of it all, will emerge. And that's when he first discovered God. Or you could say God discovered him. And that was the relationship. So what are we talking about now? What kind of entity is this? We can't use human tools to define the entity called the divine, but we could extrapolate. And we can shut down our tools and then discover realities that we never thought are possible. Actually, quantum mechanics is a very good example for this type of stuff. Because it's when you shut down your conventional logical tools is when you come to realize there are other type of realities that you would not have seen otherwise. So it comes down to this, using now the Maimonides term. He says, God. Well, before I go there, let me just say the following. So Richard Dawkins and the other atheists, their big statement, everyone always asks like this. Okay, you say nothing can create itself. Fine. That means there's a God that created everything. If nothing can create itself, then who created God? That's the next question they always ask. So, everything has a cause, fine. We have parents, our parents had parents. Everything in this world evolved from one state of being, another state of being, another state of being. But then who created the first state of being? God? So who created God? You just said nothing can create itself. This is the brilliant argument of atheists. Now, if you think about it for a few minutes, you realize that the response is very obvious. Obviously, if you're just carrying over the question from objects to God, and God is just another extension of us, of course, then the question is, who created God? But the real conclusion, this is what Abraham came to, and now I'm using Maimonides' words, is that God is a reality, an existence that's like none other. If God is an existence like ours, then obviously something had to create it as well, because nothing can exist on its own. And therefore you have the expressions, three main expressions that describe, as best as possible, the one is Maimonides' words, that God is a bilti mitzias nimtza, which means a non-existential existence. Let me explain. It means you cannot say God exists, because then you would suggest that God exists like we exist. You can't say God does not exist, so you say God exists, but not in an existence that we can even conceive of. So we exist because we manifest in certain ways. Like I said earlier, if I told you that there's a white wall right here, all you need to do is come and look at it. But what happens if I told you there's a white wall outside? You have to believe it's true. Maybe it's not. You would need proof for it to exist. A non-existential existence doesn't need proof, because proof itself is created by that non-existential existence. So in other words, what we can extrapolate is that a creator would be nothing like we are. So anything we're subject to, which includes having a cause, means the creator would have no cause. Or as another expression that's used, mitziyuse matzmuse. His cause is himself. He causes his own existence. His existence is a result of his being. By us, it's the other way around. Our being is a result of our existence. His existence is a result of his reality. So what is that reality?